Yep. All right, gang. Well, welcome. This is night 3 of 5, so this is the third of 5 sessions where we are walking through the entire storyline of the Old Testament. My name is Lee Woodmansee. For any of y'all who are joining us online and don't know who I am, I'm the campus minister here. So hopefully you got your running shoes on tonight, because we are going to be starting off in the book of Judges, but we will not be there for long. We're going to be basically spending most of our time in Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel. So essentially where we're heading is going to be covering the very end of the conquest, is where we ended last night. We're going to be picking it up with the Judges. And we're going to end with the death of Solomon, and we're going to be introducing Rehoboam and Jeroboam and what happens with their shenanigans after Solomon's death. So before we get into that point, I want to pray for us, pray for the night, pray for the technology. Hopefully all this stuff is working just fine. We don't have anyone moderating the chat back there, but if you do have any questions, you can always text me. So if you got my number, just text me, and I'll try to answer it whenever I see those questions come up. But yeah, so I want to pray for us, and then we will dive into tonight's material. Father, I thank you for the chance to be able to gather again with these students and with these folks who are joining us online, and then we'll be listening to this after the fact or watching it on YouTube. God, I thank you for us being able to sit through a long period of teaching. So God, I pray that you would give us endurance for the next hour, hour and a half as we walk through this material. God, I pray that you would give me clarity of thought. God, I pray that you would give me the words to say so that I might be able to know when to take a digression and talk a little bit about stuff that's not in the notes, and when to refrain from doing that. God, I pray that you would give me unction even tonight as we are teaching through a huge chunk of Jewish history. And God, I pray that you would use your Spirit to be able to point us to how we are to worship your Son even better. And God, that you would enlighten our hearts and our minds to the truths that we're going to be exposed to tonight, and that, frankly, that we would have questions answered, and then we'd have new questions brought up that would lead us into further faithfulness and more devotion to you. So, Father, I pray that for the men and women who are here and online. And God, I pray that you would just be honored by the way that we do this tonight. I pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. So if you are joining us online, I know we can't see the notes that we have on there, but if you look in the video description down in the YouTube video right beneath there, you'll be able to see a link that takes you to a PDF that has all the slides. So you should be able to follow along that way if you'd like. But for everyone else in here, you know how it goes. We are going to be sprinting. So I want to show you where we're heading, and you'll see kind of the major topics that we're going to be talking about, and then we're going to dive into it. So like I said, we're going to be walking through Judges all the way through the final monarch. And when I say the final monarch, that doesn't mean the final king, because there are all sorts of kings after Solomon. But what I mean by the final monarch, I mean the final monarch of the United Kingdom, of Israel, not just the northern kingdom, Israel in the north, and Judah in the south, because there's all sorts of kings for them. I'm talking about the one unified Israeli nation, right? That's what we're talking about. So we're going to be talking initially about who the judges are, what's going on in the book of Judges, and then immediately we're going to Samuel. We are not going to be spending a whole bunch of time looking at individual judges. So if you're looking to get a story about Gideon, sorry. He does not fit into the purview of his story being expansive enough to tell us about all of the judges. So we're just going to be blowing through a lot of that stuff. So we're going to be introduced to Samuel. We're going to be talking about how when he gets old, Israel clamors for a king. God gives him a king with Saul. David shows up. He's on the rise. He becomes king. Solomon, his son, he becomes a big deal. He becomes king, and then he dies. And then we're going to talk about how the kingdom is divided, and we're going to talk about Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So that's where we're basically heading. Tracking with that? All right, so if you have your Bibles open, go ahead and turn to Judges, because this is going to be a big deal for us initially. I want to talk to you about what Judges are. Judges are actually, especially just narratively with the book, it is picking up where Joshua left off. And if you remember with Joshua, with his farewell address, he basically gives this speech to the elders saying, finish the job. And what we're going to see here in a minute is they don't finish the job. There's all sorts of problems with that, right? The Judges are really, especially the book, Judges as a book, literarily, is just continuing the theme that we've seen repeated all from last night. where we saw that there's this failure that happens and that leads to a crying out and that God delivers them and provides hope, right? There's these cycles that we're going to see over and over in Judges, and that is to hold up the idea that for us, spiritual fidelity and faithfulness to God is far more important than any other aspect of what we're going to be encountering even within the stories of Judges. The example that we use is with Jericho and Ai, right? The battle plan is not what is more important, or is not what is most important. It's faithfulness to God. So, Judges picks up right where the conquest left off. But here's the deal. Judah does most of the heavy lifting in all of the rest of the conquest. And this is in the southern part of Israel, and Judah is the one who's actually doing the most work to actually complete the conquest. Now, that doesn't really help because Israel doesn't actually, the northern part of the country, they really don't do much to help in that regard. So let's just kind of, I've already introduced two new terms that we need to be really clear about. I am going to slip into talking about Israel in the north and Judah in the south. That is what we would call anachronistic, right? It is not in the right time. Right now, there is no Israel in the north and Judah in the south as two different kingdoms. This is the conquest of the land. I am taking what happens after Solomon's death and when the nation splits in two, where Israel, or sometimes called Ephraim, and 10 tribes of Israel are in the north. I will refer to them as Israel a lot of times just because there's just so much more history with that being the case. So if that happens, that's what I'm talking about. Judah and Benjamin are down in the south. Here we go. We good on that? All right, so if I slip into that, that's what's going on. So let's pick it up in Judges chapter 1. Let's pick it up in verse 27, and let's just read from there. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages. You can go to verse 29. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites. Verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants. The Amorites pressed, this is verse 34, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. And the Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Hairs, in Alijion, and in Shalibim. And the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Salah and upwards. The job's not done. The job is not done. And the author of Judges, who is probably Samuel, most likely, Samuel is reminding everyone that this wasn't just one person who had messed this up. The nation, every single tribe who had thrown their lot in to actually complete the task, failed to do so. We tracking with that? So here's one other thing we want to do. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 16 real quick. This is going to be important for us. So 2 books over to the left. Deuteronomy chapter 16. We're going to pick it up in verse 18 and 20. This is Moses speaking. This is whenever a lot of the covenant is being cut and the stipulations of the covenant is being delivered to Moses. Verse 18, you shall appoint judges and officers in all of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. And you shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality, and you shall not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice and only justice you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God has given you. But in the book that bears the name of that command, it starts off by saying, they failed to do it. They failed to do it. They failed to do it. This is where we are going to harp back on the bigger issue that we talked about, especially with the Exodus, with the plagues, is that this is a theological problem, not a practical one. They failed to be obedient. They failed to do righteousness. Okay? Does that make sense? That's kind of the overarching idea. So let's talk about Israel at this point. Israel as a whole operated as a theocracy. And what I mean by that is they had as the head of their state, their nation, was God. They didn't have a president. They didn't have a king. At times they will have judges, but even whenever you go back and look in Deuteronomy, that judge is not meant to be the king, right? Those are two separate roles that we're going to see fleshed out later in history. But the point is, whenever we see a theocracy, the main thing that is necessary is for divine intervention to be present. He God himself has to be present, and that is what is the necessary linchpin for a theocracy to work. Well, what happens when those judges take bribes? What happens when they pervert justice? What happens when they disobey? Well, God's not going to show up. That's literally the stipulations of the covenant, right? Here's the next thing. The idea of the kingdom of Israel is always present. And when we say a kingdom, that almost always implies that there is going to be a king. Moses actually prefigures that. He actually speaks about a king at one point, but we'll handle that here in a moment. But the point is, like, we have to have God's assistance for this thing to actually work, right? So, rule was always going to be conducted through certain people. We had already seen it with Moses and Aaron. When Aaron died, Eleazar, his son. When Moses dies, it goes to Joshua. When Joshua dies, it kind of falls apart. So there was always people who were selected to be ruling over the people, over the nation, but they were there to restrain evil, but they were never meant to be a king in this way. They still need God's assistance. That's why the main issue is a theological one for their faithfulness and fidelity to God and the covenant. That's why it's so critical, and that's why Judges starts off by saying, and they failed to do so. Yeah? Tracking with that? Rock on. So, the office of judge was established by Moses, and here's the deal. They were there to enact justice, and they had been failing to do so. And they had been failing to enact justice because they were being disobedient, right? Conquest is not done, and they're just acting like it is. Yeah? All right. So, let's talk about the judges in brief, very quickly. There are 12 total judges, and that is a lie. I tell you there are 12 judges, but that's not really true. There's possibly 13 because the way the language works out in the set of 2 and 3, there might be 2 people who are considered judge, but whatever. Let's just say there are 12 judges. But even then, that's not true because later Eli is called a judge in 1 Samuel, and Samuel is also called a judge, right? So I'm going to tell you the truth. There's more than 12 judges, but if you're ever taking a history test and they ask how many judges are in the book of Judges, the answer is 12, okay? Tracking with that? The first 4 were pretty good. And the last 8 suck worse and worse. They are worse than the one that came before them. And this is the one point though where I will throw in Gideon. Where we go wrong with reading the book of Gideon or of Judges is we take Gideon or we take Samson or we take any of the individual judges outside of the first 4 and we take their story and say, hey, here's an example of God's faithfulness. The problem with that is that story of God's faithfulness is situated in a much larger story about Israel's complete lack of faithfulness. Are you tracking with me? So Gideon is not just some high point of God's faithfulness. It's actually a pretty low point for the nation and how they had all failed at that point. And Gideon is even not a good example of faithfulness. He questions God twice, like to his face. He's a coward hiding in the wine press. He doesn't want to go fight. In fact, after Gideon passes from the scene, he doesn't want anything from anybody. He says, don't give me land, don't make my sons judges, don't make us in charge. But you know all those earrings you got from those folks we conquered? Let's get all those together. And he made a really cool shirt, an ephod. And after Gideon dies, Israel goes to worship the golden shirt that Gideon had made. And yet, we'll talk about Gideon as this great example of faithfulness. No. That's not how the book of Judges works. That's why you need to read the entire book as a whole. Tracking with that? That's as much as we're going to talk about an individual judge outside of Samuel. All right, so what happens through all of Judges is there is this cycle of failure where Israel is oppressed. They're brought into slavery or they're being beaten militarily. They cry out to God. God provides a judge. That judge delivers them. Then there's peace. And then we start over. And they cry out or they are oppressed and they cry out. God gives them a judge. They're delivered. Everything goes well for a time. And then we rinse and repeat. That is literally what the entire book does 12 different times. So even just me saying that, why would we pull out any individual one? Even like Deborah. Deborah's like the best one in my opinion. Deborah is like the best judge. In fact, we actually have a video on our YouTube page where we did our Women Through the Bible. We had a whole session on Deborah. She is excellent. All the rest of them fools that follow her, not so much. This is about failure over and over. If you want to see another glimpse as to what's going on in this time, go read the book of Ruth. Ruth is written during the time of the Judges. So if you're looking in your Bible, just turn to the right at the end of Judges before you get to 1 Samuel. There's this random book named Ruth right in the middle of it. Now, verse 1 of chapter 1, in the days when the judges ruled. And the picture that we see there is, it ain't great. Even whenever she finally runs into Boaz, like, it's not all flowers and happiness and unicorns. Like, there's hard times. There's famine in the land, right? Are you tracking with me? So Ruth gives us a glimpse as to what's going on here. Samuel is said to be the last judge. Eli was a judge right before him. But at the end of the day, he's really just a transitionary figure. Are you tracking with me there? He is going to be the one that goes from the judges into the monarchy with Saul. He's going to be coming down the pipe. Let's do that real quick. Go to 1 Samuel. And now we'll basically stay in 1 Samuel. Go read 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 18. Let's pick it up there. 1 Samuel 4, 18. This is speaking about the Ark of the Covenant, and this is when Eli actually dies. As soon as he had mentioned the Ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was a man old and heavy, and he had judged Israel for 40 years. So Eli was a judge. Well, turn over to chapter 7, verse 15 real quick in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, verse 15 says, Samuel judged all of Israel for all the days of his life. So this dude kind of like starts off at a pretty early age, and he is a judge until he is buried, okay? So Samuel is the last judge, but he's really just a transitionary figure. Go to Judges chapter 21, verse 25. This is the final message that we really need to pick up on with Judges. This will be the last time we go there, I promise. I messed this up in the order there. My apologies. All right, so chapter 21, pick it up in verse 25. The last line of the book. And in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Let's just stop and ponder that for a moment. How frequently does that end well for people whenever they do whatever is right in their own eyes? In the narrative so far, just from the Bible. Pretty infrequently. Like, that's a marker to say things are about to get worse. The very next story is Ruth, and then we see Samuel and Eli come on the stage. The point is, there's no king in Israel, no one is there to restrain their evil, and they are just screwing it up. Yeah? That's the judges. Cool? Moving on from the judges, no more of them. All right, let's look at Samuel. He's got a fascinating story. I love the first couple of chapters of 1 Samuel, which, by the way, Samuel probably wrote Ruth, most likely, and Judges, as well as 1 and 2 Samuel. He very well may have had a hand in the Chronicles of the Kings, which is a different book, the accounts and acts of the kings, which is a little bit different. He probably started that as like an editor, and then that tradition kept going from him. So he's actually a pretty monumental figure behind Moses for how much he wrote, right? So he's a big deal. Let's pick it up in chapter 1, verse 21 with 1 Samuel. Samuel's mom's name is Hannah, and Elkanah is her husband. The man Elkanah in his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice to pay his vow, but Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, as soon as the child is weaned, I'll bring him up, so that he may appear before the presence of the Lord forever. So what we see is immediately in the first part of this chapter is actually a very miraculous birth. Hannah is distraught. She doesn't have any kids. She goes and prays. And Eli, who's the priest at the time, the priest and the judge, he sees Hannah over there praying with her eyes closed and her mouth moving, but he can't hear anything. So the first thing he thinks is, homegirl's drunk. So he like rebukes her, like, what are you doing? You're drunk. And she's like, no, I'm praying. And Eli gets it, and he's like, okay, well then I pray that the Lord will give you whatever you ask. And her prayer was, give me a son, and I'll give him to the Lord for him to serve the Lord all the rest of his days of his life. Boom, there's Samuel. So he's dedicated at the temple. You can go look at her prayer in chapter 2. This is a marvelous prayer. 1 Samuel chapter 2 is mirrored in many ways by Luke chapter 2 with the Magnificat. Whenever we see Mary, when she starts praising God and singing a song at the beginning of Luke's gospel, it mirrors thematically every single thing that Hannah says. So Mary, in the New Testament, knew her Bible. She knew Hannah's prayer, and she reflects a lot of the same things whenever she prays. You can just go look at that for yourself. So Samuel's dedicated at the temple or the tabernacle. He's going to be working for the Lord the whole days of his life. Boom, there we go. All right, so let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. You may even have a subheading over your section there. Does anyone have a subheading there in chapter 2, verse 12? The wicked sons, Eli's worthless sons is what mine says. This is what we read. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord, and the custom of the priest with the people that was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant would come, and when the meat was boiling, with a three-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle, cauldron or pot, and the fork brought out, that's what he'd eat. So these cats were fat, and they were lazy, they didn't know the traditions, and they would go just basically using their position for their own self-enrichment. But the thing that we need to pick up on there is that they did not know the Lord. That's the most critical indictment over Eli's sons, Phinehas and Hophni, right? Those two guys are worthless. And so what actually happens is that God actually rejects Eli's household. He says, those sons of yours are not going to be the guys who are going to take over when you die, right? You can actually pick up on that there in verse 34. And this shall come to you upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. Dog, you're going to bury both your sons in one day. God rejects them. The reason that this is an issue is because they had treated God's sacrifices with contempt, and they were going to die on the same day like we just read. These dudes are worthless, which sets the stage for Samuel to enter the fray. Tracking with that? So let's pick it up in 1 Samuel chapter 5. Let's pick it up in verse 4, chapter 4. Whenever you look in chapter 4, you see that the Philistines already have the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is going to be a very central element through all of 1 and 2 Samuel, because how many wars are fought with the Philistines to get the Ark of the Covenant back and moving it to where it's supposed to be, and it falls off the cart, all sorts of crazy stuff, right? Like the Ark of the Covenant is a big deal. And whenever we think about the Ark of the Covenant, we should remember what's in that Ark of the Covenant. At this point, it's the two tablets that were broken by Moses, demonstrating that Israel had broken the covenant with God. But yet, the Ark of the Covenant continued to be with Israel. That was a sign of God's favor on them. And it contains literally the broken tablets from when they had broken the law back in Exodus 32. We can go read that story with the golden calf, right? Tracking with me? That's from last night. All right, so if you look in chapter 5 and 6, you'll see that there's this covenant that is made with Samuel, that he's going to be the one who's going to take their place. The Philistines are going to capture the ark, then it's going to be recaptured by Israel, it's going to be brought back, all this stuff, crazy things, right? We don't have enough time to get into that. Turn to chapter 7, verse 15. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and he went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, Mitzvah, and he judged Israel in all of these places. And then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there, and he also judged Israel, and he built there an altar to the Lord. And so what Samuel was doing is basically running the circuit. He's going to every town that's major at this point and dealing with the crazy things that are going on. Did you notice one of the cities that's not mentioned there that you would have expected to be mentioned here? Read them again. Bethel, Gilgal, Mitzvah, and Ramah. What's one city that you would anticipate should be there but isn't? It's kind of a big deal in Israel. Jerusalem. Why is that? It's because Jerusalem was still in the hands of the Philistines at this time. David is the one who eventually finally conquers Jerusalem and then makes it his capital. Are you tracking with me? So we're that far away from history being centered on Jerusalem. The tabernacle is still where worship takes place, the tent of meeting, where the Ark of the Covenant just kind of parks, right? So we're pretty far away from what we think of the Old Testament normally. We're still pretty far away from that even now, yeah? Tracking with that? All right, so Samuel's running around everywhere. He's judging Israel. He's leading them. Rock on. All right, so how did we get from this transitionary figure of Samuel to actually getting a king? Well, let's talk about generally what's going on here. Pick it up in chapter 8, verse 1. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. And the name of the firstborn son was Joel, and the name of the second, Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but they turned aside after gain, and they took bribes, and they perverted justice. So even though they're made judges, they're not judges. And this is why Samuel is the last judge. Are you tracking with me? So he installs his sons as judges. However, here's the problem. He knows that his age is actually working against him. Because even chapter 8 begins when he became old. He knows he's got to do something to keep this thing on the rails. Problem is, this ain't going to be it. These two sons of his, they ain't going to fly. Joel and Abijah are not going to be the guys that God's going to use, right? So pick it up in chapter 8, verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and they came to Samuel at Ramah, at his house. They recognized how old this dude was. And they're like, hey man, we need to talk about some succession issues here. Who's going to lead us when you die? Your sons? Come on now. That's basically the conversation they have. They come to Ramah and they said to him, behold, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations, which is a weird thing to say. You don't expect the king to judge you in the way the judges do. You expect the king to rule and lead in that way. So there's already this weird conception of what a king is even going to do. And we're going to see Samuel correct him on that here in just a moment. But at the end of the day, the elders gather and they demand a king. And the reason they demand a king is because, dude, you're getting old, your sons ain't going to work, and we want a king like all of the nations. They were envious that the nations around them had kings. And from the jump, Samuel is absolutely against it. Absolutely against it. Because remember, in his lifetime, he had been faithful to God. He had been leading. He had been judging. He had been bringing about justice. And so that theocracy was working. He saw God's presence there. He's like, no, just keep doing what we're doing. Why do we need a king? Problem with that is, your boys ain't going to be the ones that are going to be continuing justice. They're perverting justice. And so there's a problem already, right? So Samuel is absolutely against it. However, let's pick it up in verse 6. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give to us a king. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, verse 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. The theocracy is now, in many senses, kaput. They wanted my presence. Well, really what it turns out is they really just wanted my blessing. They didn't want to do everything that was commanded of them by the covenant for this theocracy to work. Cool, fine, let's do that. Let's give them a king. Let's give them a king. And so God allows there to be a king over Israel. And this is one of my favorite parts of Samuel. He actually then goes to them and tells them what having a king really means. Pick it up there in verse 10. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king. Okay, I talked to God. He said, you know what? Let's get us a king. But, verse 11, he said, these will be the ways the king will reign over you. And he uses the right word, reign. This is what a king's going to do. He's going to rule. He's going to reign over you. He's going to reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and he will plow the ground and to reap the harvest, and to make his implements of war and for the equipment of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. And he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive gardens and give them to his servants. And he will take, and he will take, and he will take, and he will take. The whole point there is, when did God take all this? Because the story so far, especially from the conquest in Joshua, is that God has just been giving. You want a king? He's not going to judge. He's going to rule. He's going to reign. And when he does, he's going to take. He's going to take the best. He's going to take the most. And when you think it's enough, he's going to take more. He's going to take. So he tells them what a king is actually going to do. If you want to peek ahead and look at Saul, he does these exact things almost immediately. Almost instantly. Oh, we got this problem with the Philistines. You're our king now. What do we do? Well, where's our army? He's like, well, we don't have an army. Guess what? You about to. get all your boys together. We about to go get us a fight. Like almost instantly, Saul begins to do exactly the things that Samuel says. You don't want a king for these reasons, and that's what he's going to do. Tracking with that? So this is just the road to the monarchy. Let's now actually talk about the monarchy. The monarchy is going to be begun by Saul. And so we're going to pick up in chapter 9 with his selection. There in chapter 9, verse 1, there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abriel, the son of Zeor, son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah, a Benjaminite, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul. Saul was a handsome dude. And there was not a young man among the people of Israel more handsome than him. Man, he's a good-looking cat. And from his shoulders upwards, he was taller than any of the people. Wow. Cool. So if we just lay out with our introduction of Saul, what are his qualifications to be king? He looks good and he's tall. I'm dead serious. That's his qualifications. And Israel's like, hey, that guy right there, he's the one we want. And now, obviously, God is working through history. He is sovereign. He is in control of this. And he allows Saul to be chosen, but he is selected. He's good looking and he's tall. So basically, there's this fiasco going on with Saul's father and his donkeys. They're chasing him. He eventually runs into Samuel. He's like, hey, I'm looking for these donkeys. And Samuel's like, you're the guy that's going to be king. It's just a really weird thing that happens. Go look in the reading the rest of chapter 9. We don't have time to handle all of it here. But let's pick it up in chapter 9, verse 17. Here's something that's really critical. Now, the day before Saul became king, this is verse 15, sorry. Chapter 9, verse 15. Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord revealed to Samuel, tomorrow about this time I'll send you and the man of the land of Benjamin, and you shall appoint him to be prince or king over Israel, over all my people, and he shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines, for I have seen my people because their cry has come to me. That's the exact same structure from Judges, except now it's not going to be a judge, it's going to be a king, okay? So we are seeing God even graciously hearing their cry and responding. Verse 17, and when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, here's the man whom I spoke to you. It is he who will restrain my people. The king, in every instance, from the very beginning of the monarchy, his purpose is to restrain the people from evil. That is literally what Paul's argument is in Romans 13. That is what Peter's argument is in 1 Peter chapter 3. That is the deal. Government, in this case, kings are meant to restrain the people's evil. Are you tracking with that? Problem with that is, as we know with Saul, he doesn't quite really restrain. He actually compels it in many ways. Tracking with that? David fails at that as well. Solomon definitely fails at that. And that's because we're failures. We are sinners. We are broken. Yep. So Samuel anoints Saul as king there in chapter 10, verse 1. And then let's pick it up in chapter 10, verse 6. After he's anointed, verse 6. Then the Spirit of the Lord will rush upon you. The Spirit, the Ruach, the wind of God, the Spirit of God will rush upon you, and you will prophesy with him and be turned into another man. And then when these signs meet you, do what your hand finds to do, for God is with you. Whenever he's empowered by the Holy Spirit for this task, he's going to be able to do no wrong. Think of it that way. Like that's literally what's going on. Whatever your hand finds to do, go do it because the Lord is with you. Now, the problem with that is the Spirit is not permanent in the Old Testament. His residence is not in them, it's with them in some senses, around them temporarily. We actually have an entire series on this from last fall when we talked about pneumatology, okay? So, the Spirit rushes upon Saul. He eventually waits a couple of days on Samuel to get there. They make some sacrifices. Boom, now he's king. Chapter 10, verses 19 through 24. Saul's now the king. We got us a bona fide monarch. This is now a legit kingdom, and everybody's good. Everything's great. Well, here we go. Pick it up in chapter 11, verse 11. Verse 10, therefore the men of Jabesh said, tomorrow we will give ourselves up to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you. And the next day Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites in the day of the heat. And those who survived were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. Almost instantly, the very next chapter, Saul gathers an army, and he begins to defend the nation. This is literally what Samuel told him was going to happen. And here we see it coming to fruition. He actually gathers about 300,000 dudes. You can pick it up there in chapter 11, verse 8. Where's it at? Verse 8. When he mustered them at Bezek, the people of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. So even now, Samuel's actually already talking about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Israel and Judah, but they're not in separate kingdoms. This is all one, right? 330,000 dudes are gathered overnight, essentially, by the king, okay? So, good news. He actually calls the people to faithfulness. Pick it up in chapter 11, verse 12. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who is it that says, shall Saul reign over us? Bring them in that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has worked salvation in Israel. He's restraining the evil of the people." Good on you, Saul. You're doing what you're supposed to do. Verse 14. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingdom." That's the language of renewing the covenant. There they sacrificed peace offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. There we see Saul calling the nation to faithfulness, and this is great news. So what do we expect of Samuel? He retires. We got us the king. Okay, I think this is going to go bad, but I'm going to step out. I'm going to go back to Ramah. You know where I am if you need me. But you got Saul. He's called you to covenantal faithfulness. He's restraining evil. He's defending the nation. He's reigning. This is what you wanted. Deuces. But here's the problem. Look at chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. Saul lived for 1 year, and then he became king. And when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, Saul chose 3,000 men of Israel, 2,000 with the men of Saul of Michmash in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Geba and Benjamin. He now has a standing army. He's not marshaling 300,000 dudes to go fight somebody. He's just got a couple thousand men laying around to do whatever he wants. And that's one of the first indicators that we see that this is actually about to start going bad. When Samuel retires, we actually see that he is basically feeling rejected by the people. And it's the same thing that happened back in chapter 2. It's like God's telling him, they didn't reject you as judge, they rejected me as king. But he's still feeling this, and so he's rejected, he retires. But like we've already said, he's actually just he's the butt end of the rejection of God, really. So Saul reduces his army. He's got a standing army now. This is this elite group there in chapter 13. And away we go. We're really full-fledged now. We got a king who's actually doing kingly things. Right up until he doesn't. Check it out in chapter 13, verse 8. Does anyone have a subheading in your Bible there of chapter 13, verse 8? An unlawful sacrifice. Verse 8. Speaking of Saul, he waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offering here to me, and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offerings. And as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, here comes Samuel, the guy who is like his last thing, his last act in office as a judge, as the prophet, as the one who's be able to offer these sacrifices. He walks up and he sees Saul doing it, which he is not permitted to do at all. Samuel actually told him as much. Wait on me. And the last time that happened, he waited. But this time, not so much. And so now we're starting to see that Saul, even though he was supposed to wait on Samuel, he's hasty, makes a sacrifice himself. And then we are already told, just a couple of years in, monarchy is going to get taken from you. Look at chapter 13, pick it up in verse 13. And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord." It's not a practical issue, it is a theological one. You are supposed to be faithful to God. I told you to do this, you didn't do it. That's the problem. You were not faithful to the Lord your God, which he commanded you, for when the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. Dog, if you'd have just waited and been faithful, he would have made your family the kings of Israel forever. 14. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince or king over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And so Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal. Apparently, I'm not retiring anymore. And the rest of the people went up after Saul to meet with the army, and they went from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. So the monarch is going to be taken from Saul, and then the first cracks start to show. The army starts scattering. No one's trusting Saul. The Philistines start attacking again. It's all bad. It's all bad. Pick it up in chapter 14. You should see Jonathan being mentioned here. This is where the story really shifts to Jonathan. So we're thinking, okay, cool. If Saul is not going to be the guy, well, what about his son? Yeah, the kingdom's taken away from Saul, but what about his son, Jonathan? Well, what we get is that Jonathan's a pretty big deal, but he's not going to be the guy either. He's not going to be a guy either. He's going to be the best friend of who the guy will be, but he's not going to be the guy. Pick it up there in chapter 14, verses 13 through 15. Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. And that first strike, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, killed about 20 men within, as it were, half a furlong's length and an acre of land. And there was panic in the camp. Basically, there's this encampment up on a bluff, and these guys are taunting Jonathan, saying, look, we got the high ground. You're not going to come get us. And Jonathan's like, bet. I'm coming up there. You're coming with me too, dude. They climb this sheer cliff face. They get up there on the edge of the cliff, and they go to work and start killing these cats. And we start thinking, this must be the guy who's going to take Saul's place. But just because he's daring and he has all this fame, he's not going to be the guy. And that is then made even more clear by what happens by Saul in the rest of the chapter. Verse 24 of chapter 14. And then the men of Israel had been hard-pressed that day, and so Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged of my enemies, so that none of the people tasted food. And now when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. When the people went into the forest, and they saw the honey was dropping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, the people feared the oath. Basically what Saul says is, I'm not going to be shown up by my son. No one is going to eat until we finish the job. And that's just a demonstration of how he's not restraining evil, but he's actually participating in it himself. He makes this rash vow, and then Jonathan's actually the one who breaks it. Jonathan's actually the one who goes and gets him some of that honey. You can look at it there in 14 all the way towards the end of the chapter in 43. Pick it up in 42. Saul said, cast the lot between my son and with Jonathan, and Jonathan was taken. And so Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. And Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the tip of my staff that was in my hand, and here I am. I will die. Our hope of Jonathan being the guy, he now fails. Now, he failed because Saul had screwed up, but you see the pattern here. This is not going to continue with Saul. It's going to go from bad to worse. We tracking with that? All right, so we're going to talk about David next. But before we get to David, do I have any questions about Judges, Samuel, Saul so far? I know we are covering a lot of narrative here. All right. So let's pick it up in chapter 15, verse 8. This is, you may even have a heading that says, the Lord rejects Saul. And the Lord took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs and all that was good. And he would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. So if it was worth keeping, they kept. And everything else, like, well, God wants this stuff for us, but all the other stuff, yeah, we'll burn it up. This is a repetition of what happened back at Ai, what we covered last night. After Jericho fell and everything was great, but there was Achan who had sinned and had not done fully what God had told him to do, because it's a theological issue, not a practical one. The exact same thing rears its head here. And here, Saul doesn't restrain the evil of the people, he participates in it himself, right? And so God actually is going to be absolutely rejected as king. You can look in verse 11. Verse 10, the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me, and he has not performed my commandments. The issue is he hasn't been faithful. It's a theological issue. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. And Samuel arose early to meet Saul in the morning, and it was told to Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he has set up a monument for himself, and has turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. So here's Samuel needing to go confront Saul, and the next thing he says, oh, he ain't here. I mean, his statue's here, but he ain't here. It just goes from bad to worse. So, Saul's rejected. They didn't fully devote the things to destruction, everything they were supposed to devote, and they were partially obedient. And what's another word for partial obedience? Disobedience. So let's pick it up in verse 16 through 19. So he finds out about this thing. Let's pick it up in 14. And Samuel said, what is it then, this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen? Hey guy, you told me about this statue. What about all those animals? Where'd you get them? And Saul said, they have brought them up from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen and the sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we've devoted to destruction. You notice how he tries to lie? He didn't keep it for himself. I kept it for God. We're going to sacrifice these things. That's not what happened. Like, that's not what was said 10 verses earlier. But now, we're keeping them to sacrifice. I mean, you're here. I mean, we're going to sacrifice them. And then Samuel said to Saul, stop. Quit lying to me. I will tell you what the Lord has said to me this night. And so Saul says, speak. And Samuel said, though you are little in your own eyes, you are not the head of the tribes of Israel. Aren't you a big deal? Yeah. The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are consumed. Why did you not then obey the voice of your Lord? He claps back at him and says, this is not how it's going down. You're trying to feign this obedience and that you're actually trying to work towards a sacrifice. This is not how this is going to go. The kingdom's going to be stripped from you. And so Samuel, however old he is, probably crazy old, is telling the king he's no longer going to be king. What kind of fortitude do you think it took for that old man to say that? Let you think about that. Pick it up in chapter 16. David is then introduced. He's the youngest son of Jesse. This is what we'll say, just to encapsulate this whole story. David is the least likely candidate. He is not the guy you want on your team. He's a runt. He's the guy who is out there as a musician in the field. We got some other brothers that are over here that are pretty good-looking dudes. There's some tall cats. Even Samuel says when he first meets the first son, he's like, oh, surely this is the guy. And God's like, nah. Oh, well, the next son, who's, a little bit shorter, but, also good. God's, nah. And he runs through all his sons. And Samuel's like, well, Jesse, you got any more? Got any more sons? And he's like, well, I got one, but you don't want him. And Samuel's like, no, go get that dude. So David is the least likely candidate. Let's pick it up in verse 12 through 14 of chapter 16. Let's pick it up 12. And he sent and he brought him in, and now he was a ruddy and beautiful eyes and handsome. Okay, cool. All right. Good-looking dude. Saul was good-looking. Maybe that's the qualifications we're looking for here. And the Lord said, arise and anoint him, for this is he. And then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David, just like it did with Saul. It had departed him, but now the Spirit of the Lord's on David. And from that day forward, and Samuel rose up and he went to Ramah. Verse 14, and now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. David is anointed as king. The Spirit of God rushes upon him. And that's basically, in many ways, the close of the book of Saul. Now, he's going to keep being king for quite a while, and he's going to keep making problems, especially for David. But he's functionally no longer the one who's really running things. He doesn't even have the Spirit of the Lord in him, right? How is he going to be able to accomplish the task that God has set before him as king? He can't. Now, David, on the other hand, he's going to start rising in many different ways. So, the first thing that we see is that David is put into Saul's service. And basically, this is, narratively, he's given a front row seat to observe how Saul went down, how he went from bad to worse. I mean, he's the guy who was playing music whenever Saul couldn't sleep. He's the guy who saw him at his worst. He's the guy who saw him going from bad to even worse. Are you tracking with me? That has to make an impression on David. Has to. I think that's one reason why whenever we see David confronted with his own sin, we see him repent. We see him see what happened to Saul and say, I'm not doing that. I'm going to come back to the Lord. Tracking with that? So now David is on the ascent, Saul is on the descent. That is the language we're going to use for the rest of the time as we look through the Old Testament, when we're going to see one group or one person on the rise and someone else on the fall, okay? We're going to talk about what kingdom's doing that later. We'll get to that in the next 2 nights. All right, David and Goliath, the great story about David. Kills this dude with a rock, cuts his head off with a massive sword. By the way, that sword that Goliath carries around, like, there's no way David would have been able to pick that up by himself. Like, it just ain't going to happen. So how do you think he was able to, one, hit this giant with a rock and kill him, and then literally lift a sword that was bigger than he was? How do you think a little dude did that? I don't know. I think we know. It's the Spirit of God, right? That's the only way he's able to do this. David and Goliath is not a story about you fighting your situation. It's about how you are a failure and you absolutely need God in order to overcome anything. Your problems are not Goliath and you are not David. You tracking with that? So, that's all we're going to say about David and Goliath. You can go read chapter 17 about that. I do want to read 1751. This is great. I just want to read this. 1751. Pick it up in verse 50. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and he struck the Philistine and he killed him. Cool. Great. And there was no sword in the hand of David. Well, you know, he doesn't need a sword. Verse 51. And then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, and he killed him, and he cut off his head with it, and the Philistines saw their champion was dead, and they took off. That sword eventually is going to go hang over some dude's hearth later in life, and when David's on the run from Saul, or maybe even Adonijah at that point, or Adonijah, he's running, maybe Absalom. He's on the run. Let's say it that way. David's on the run. He doesn't have a weapon. He goes and gets that sword eventually. So it kind of comes back full circle. So he goes and cuts Goliath's heads off. It's great. Chapter 18, we see this friendship with David and Jonathan start to bloom, right? Jonathan's a pretty bad dude. You don't want to be messing with him. Yeah, well, David just killed Goliath, like the champion of the Philistines, and he did it with a rock. He took 5. He only needed 1. Like, there's going to be the makings of a great friendship right there. They've got everything they need. Pick it up in chapter 18, verse 8. And Saul was very angry, and the saying, let's pick it up in verse 7. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Saul was a big deal, but dog, have you heard about David? That dude's killing everybody. He whacked that dude's head off with a sword he couldn't even pick up. Crazy. Saw it with my own eyes. Verse 8, and Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed thousands, and what more can he have done, or can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on, and the irony of that statement is, what is this dude? What, do you think he's king or something? Kinda, yeah. You don't know that yet. And David's waiting for that to officially take place. But yeah, he has the kingdom already. He has the Spirit of God. He has everything that you don't, is kind of the language that's being used there. So, now Jonathan is associated with the army. He's the one who's leading. He's like the primary general of main importance there. Saul's envious of David's success. We've already just talked about that. And so David then marries into the royal family by Michal, right? Pick it up in chapter 18, verse 20. Now Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David, and they told Saul, and this thing pleased him. Saul thought, hey, let me give him to her, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Wait, what? It pleased him that eventually this might be the downfall of David. Does that sound like the kind of king who rules with justice and restrains the evil of the people? Absolutely not. So David marries into this family. He's now in the royal line of succession in some sense. But we know that he's really the king already, right? Pick it up in 19 through 24. Let's just read some subheadings. Chapter 19, my subheading says, Saul tries to kill David. Chapter 20, Jonathan warns David. Chapter 21, David in the holy bread. This is when he's on the run. David at the cave of Adullam. This is when he's on the run. Saul kills the priest of Nob because they wouldn't give David up. I mean, like, he is on the run from Saul for the next 4 or 5 chapters. Saul tries to kill David, but on more than one occasion, David actually spares Saul's life. And the reason he spares Saul's life is not because this is a matter of practicality and we need to have like a military tribunal actually recognize me as king and you're no longer the king, and if I kill you now, we can't do that. No, his argument is, I can't kill the Lord's anointed. So David, even in his restraint, is pointing back to the theological argument that God is the one who put this dude in charge. I cannot be a usurper in that way. And it's not a practicality issue, it's a theological issue. Yeah? I'm beating that phrase over and over because that is what is going on in the narrative, yeah? So, Saul tries to kill David. David spares Saul. Let's pick it up in chapter 25. Chapter 25, verse 1. And now Samuel died. And all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house in Ramah. When Samuel dies, this is when things get real dicey. Because at this point, the only other person who was ever really able to restrain Saul was Samuel. And he's gone now. And he's gone. Peek ahead to chapter 31. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens with David and him running from Saul. He gets married. He goes to the Philistines. Like he is so desperate to run from Saul. He actually goes to the Philistines. Pick it up in chapter 31. Now the Philippines, verse 1. Now the Philippines. The Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain at Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua and the sons of Saul. And the battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. It's going real bad for Saul. Writing's on the wall, right? So, verse 4, Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly, and therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. Immediately after Samuel's death, the next big step in Israel's history is Saul's death. And as much as we would like to say this is actually good news, it's not. It really isn't, because the entire royal family is wiped out. All of Saul's sons are dead. Jonathan has already demonstrated that he's not going to be the guy, but what about these other 2 cats? Well, they're dead. So in one fell swoop, we have Samuel, Saul, and his 3 sons. You got the 5 next leaders of Israel are all dead. And then we see there the close of the book. That's how 1 Samuel ends, with a cliffhanger. What are we going to do? What's the deal with these folks, right? We see that the Philistines come and they mistreat Saul's body. They cut his head off, paraded around on a pike, all sorts of bad stuff. What's going to happen? Well, that's where we get to the next big step. David comes out of hiding, and now he's going to be king. Are you tracking with me? All right, so now we've covered Judges, Samuel, Saul. All of them are dead. David's left standing. Questions? What can I clarify at this point, if anything? As I take a moment to drink, because I'm dying up here. Are you tracking with all this? Okay. All right. Let's pick it up in chapter 2, verse 4 of 2 Samuel. Let's pick it up in verse 1. And after this, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to the cities of Judah? He's like, can I leave here? Can I go back to where I'm from?" And the Lord said, "Go up." David said, "Where do I go?" He said, "To Hebron." And David went up there, and his wives with him. And David brought up his men who were with him, and everyone with his household, and he lived there in the towns of Hebron. Verse 4, and the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So the first thing that happens is David finally makes it back to his country, and the first thing these dudes do is they find out where he is, and they come anoint him as king over Judah. So we're already starting to see the cracks form in the entire nation. We've already got just one tribe saying, "You're our king." And it's going to roll forward from there. There's this cat named Ishbosheth. We'll pick him up in chapter 2, verse 8. But Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. And more than likely, this is a guy who is has no prominence, but he's got just some tangential connection to Saul. So we know what we're going to make him king. And they're making him king over Gilead and the Asherites and Jezreel and Ephraim. Ephraim is like the catch-all for all the northern tribes, and Benjamin and all of Israel. And Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old, and he began to reign over Israel. Here's just a question. Where was that guy whenever Saul died? Where was he? Because we know for a fact he wasn't at the battle, because he would have died there. This is why there's some contention as to whether this dude was a legitimate son or not. Neither here nor there. This is royal politics that's going on here, right? David's the king in Judah. Ishbosheth is the king up north, and there's a civil war. This nation is 25 years old as a king, or as a monarchy, and they already have their first civil war. This is a demonstration of how we need God to rule. Didn't see this happen with the judges. Yeah, they didn't have a civil war necessarily, but they definitely had all sorts of oppression, but that was because of their unfaithfulness. And now we're seeing the fruit of Saul's unfaithfulness to the Lord and to the covenant that he had made and not keeping his commandments. And now you got a civil war, open civil war in Israel. Tracking with that? So let's pick it up in chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. You can read about the civil war in chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 5, let's pick it up verse 1. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In the times past when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. They recognized, hey, we knew then, Saul wasn't really the king. You were the guy that kept everything together. And the Lord said to you, You shall be the shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince or king over Israel. And so all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed him, David, king over Israel. And David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. At Hebron he joined over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, hey, there it is, finally. In Jerusalem he reigned over Israel and Judah 33 years. So David finally unifies all of Israel for the next 30-something years. That's great news, right? We actually see in chapter 6, David brings the ark back to Jerusalem. It had been camping out at this one dude's house, and that dude's house had just overflowed with prosperity. He had all these kids, had all these agricultural products. It was a great blessing. And David's hey man, we need to get it to Jerusalem because that's where it needs to stay at the tent of meeting. So they moved everything there, right? Pick it up in chapter 7, verse 9. You may have a subheading there in chapter 7. This is the first time we meet a cat named Nathan, and Nathan's going to be a big deal in the next 10 chapters or so. Now the king lived in the house of the Lord, had given him rest from all of his surrounding enemies, and the king said to Nathan the prophet, See, I dwell in this house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. You know what I need to do? Let's build a temple for God. So God actually cuts a covenant with David through Nathan, right? Chapter 7, verse 9. Speaking of verse 8, Now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, Thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be king over the people of Israel, and I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I make for you a great name like the name of the great ones of the earth. Ooh, I will make you a great name like the rest of the earth. What language does that remind you of? That's Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The covenant with Abraham. I'm going to give you a family. I'm going to make your name great, and you're going to be a blessing to all the nations. That language is just being recycled in different ways and applied to David now. So he's cutting a covenant with David. Chapter 7, verse 9 basically says, let's pick it in verse 10. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And I appointed the judges. Now I got you, the Lord declares, that he will make you a house. And when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will make you raise up offspring after you, and you shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He's talking about his son. Verse 13, He, his son, shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. David is assured that the kingdom is going to continue through his family. The opposite of what happened to Saul, right? David's son is going to be the one who builds the temple. And then, let's pick it up in chapter 12. You can read in chapter 11 where David really screws things up. He's supposed to be out at war. He's not. He's on top of his palace. He sees this chick who's really attractive, taking a bath. Her name's Bathsheba. And David's like, hey, bring her to me. They have sex. She gets pregnant. David kills her husband, Uriah, who's one of the commanders of his army. And then Nathan in chapter 12 blows the doors off this dude. So Nathan, the same guy who promised him that the Lord was with him, is now happened to be the guy who's going to confront him in his sin. However, look at chapter 12, verse 24. Then David comforted his wife, Bathsheba, and he went into her and he laid with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him and sent a message by Nathan the prophet, and so he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord. And if you look down there what Jedediah means, it means beloved of the Lord. So even in the middle of David's sin, in his repentance, go read Psalm 51, David is restored and he's given a son, and that son just so happens to have the name loved by God. A little bit later on in the New Testament, you're going to see another son who's called loved by God. Except where Jesus will live out perfectly and won't fail, Solomon absolutely does. Yeah? Tracking with that? So, Solomon is now born. We are rolling through the rest of this. We are picking up some speed. All right. Now we're going to start talking about David on the decline and Solomon on the ascent, right? This is the language we're going to start using here. So, pick it up in chapter 24, 2 Samuel. There's all sorts of other stuff that happens in between. Go read it for yourself. We're worried about chapter 24. Chapter 24, verse 1. Again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go number Israel and Judah. And so the king said to Joab, the commander of the army, who was with him, go through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know the number of the people. David gets this census of all of his fighting men because he's wanting to be assured towards the end of his life that his life meant something in some way. That's basically what's going on here. And so in his pride and his arrogance, God gives it this opportunity to go count the people, and that's absolutely the worst thing that he could do. You can see a little bit later on, chapter 24, verse 10. David's heart struck him after he had numbered the people, and David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done, but now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have done foolishly. And God tells him, oh no, someone's got to pay. Someone's going to pay for the fact that you are no longer fit to be king. And so there is judgment that falls on the nation, and it's eventually halted, but there are people who pay. And at this point, David's effectively done being king. That's like the last thing we see David do. So I want you to turn the page, and you should run into this book named 1 Kings. 1 Kings is now going to start telling the story of Solomon. So let's back it up. Judges, these 12-ish people who are judges over Israel. Then you get 1 Samuel, which is about Samuel and Saul. 2 Samuel is about David. 1 Kings is about Solomon. Are you tracking with that? That's basically how that works. Chronologically, there's more that goes on in there. They do have some Tarantino-esque moments where they kind of flash back here and there. Don't worry about it. Here's what we see. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5. Now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. He makes a big to-do. I'm going to be the king, right? Verse 9, Adonijah sacrificed sheep, oxen, and fattened cattle by the serpent stone, which is beside En Rogel, and he invited all the brothers, the king's sons, and all the royal officials to Judah. But he left one invitation out. He didn't invite Nathan the prophet. But he did not invite Nathan the prophet or Benaiah, who's the guy who went down into a pit on a snowy day with a spear and killed himself alive by himself. And he's going to invite Benaiah or the mighty men or Solomon. So he's trying to usurp the throne, and eventually he sets himself up as king. He is the one who sees David on the outs. We got a succession crisis. Got a whole bunch of wives at this point, and a whole bunch of sons. What's going to happen? I'm the guy. But he's going to leave out Benaiah, Nathan, and some of the other folks who are really important, like Solomon. So eventually Nathan and Bathsheba intervene, and the problem with that is, well, now we've got us a problem because you've got a dude who tried to usurp the throne, and now the rightful king, Solomon, who David had picked, he comes to power instead of Adonijah, and now that cat's got to die. That cat's got to die, right? So in many ways, Solomon's first act as king is in fact to restrain the evil of the people. It just happens to be something that happened right before he was king with Adonijah. Are you tracking with that? So Solomon shows up. He's now made king. And the first time that we really want to talk about Solomon here, chapter 2, you can see David actually dies, and he invests all of his power into Solomon. Rock on. Solomon is now king. Check it out in chapter 3. This is where Solomon's prayer for wisdom comes in. Pick it up in verse 9 of chapter 3. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this your great people? Dude, I'm just a young guy. There's no way I can do this, Lord. If I'm going to do what you told me to do, what I saw my father do well, it's going to have to be through you. Kind of sounds like a theocracy, doesn't it? He understood the theological implications of being the king. David understood it. Saul, not so much. Verse 10, and it pleased the Lord that Solomon asked this, and God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for your long life or riches or life or your enemies, but you've asked for something for yourself, understanding to discern what is right, behold, I'll do that for you. And everything else I just mentioned I'm going to give to you as well. So now we have Solomon. His prayer for wisdom sets him up to be the next great leader, and now we are literally in the golden age of Israel. Their borders have been expanded under David. They've been consolidated under his reign over the last 30 years. They have fortified borders. Everyone knows who's in charge. Solomon actually has several vassal states. Moab, Edom, a couple of folks like the Amalekites up north. All those cats are paying money to Solomon so that he doesn't kill them all, right? This is the golden age of Israel. And the kingdom is flourishing under Solomon. Go read 1 Kings chapter 4. In 1 Kings chapter 6, Solomon builds the temple. Exactly what Nathan told David was going to happen. Not going to be you, it's going to be your son. Well, here we go. And this temple is absolutely extravagant. Go read about the temple in 1 Kings chapter 6 through 8. It's great stuff. We don't have time to talk about it though. Chapter 9. Pick it up in chapter 9, verse 1 of 1 Kings. And as soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to build, which according to Ecclesiastes and a couple other places was a bunch of stuff. Every one of his wives got their own palace, they got their own vineyard, they got their own lake, and they got their own orchard, like forest. This dude built whatever he pleased. Whatever he desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time as he appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you have made before me, and I have consecrated this house that you've built with the temple. And by putting my name there forever, my eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as for you, if you walk before me, like your father did, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I've commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I'll establish your royal throne forever, just like I told David. So God continues the covenant with Solomon. Great news. But we know what happens with Solomon. Go look at chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughters of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonite, Sidonian, Hittite women, from the nations concerning the Lord, which has been said to the people of Israel, you are not to enter into marriage with them. Verse 3. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as his heart, the heart of his father David was. So Solomon's lives eventually leads him astray. 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000 marital relationships. That can't be healthy. There's all sorts of crazy stuff that happens during this time period, so I want to just take one step away from Solomon. At this point, most likely, Joshua, the rest of Judges, after Samuel had finished writing what he could, the rest of Samuel and Judges was written during this time. All of Solomon's thousands of proverbs were written. There are great culturally significant works are made during this time. Poetry, art, literal construction. This is truly Israel's golden age. But that's all about to come crashing down, literally. As soon as Solomon dies, Rehoboam is on the scene. And Rehoboam is going to be Solomon's son. He's the rightful heir. But we saw the last time that the last king was about to come on board, and he was about to die. Some usurpers showed up. And that's where we get Jeroboam, the Ephraimite. He's eventually told, we'll recover all this stuff tomorrow, but we're going to bring it to the point right here. Go look in 1 Kings chapter 11. Pick it up in verse 31, or actually verse 26. Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, the Ephraimite from Zedorah, a servant of Solomon. He's just a servant, right? He eventually runs into this cat, verse 29, Ahijah the Shilonite. He's a prophet, and he found him. Verse 31, and this prophet said to Jeroboam, take for yourself these 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I'm about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and I'm going to give you 10 tribes. So Rehoboam shows up, everything's about to be his, but then there's this random cat named Jeroboam who's a servant, gets told by a prophet, actually the kingdom's going to come crashing down. But in the rest of that part, we'll cover this a little bit more tomorrow, there's the promise made to David. Go read verse 34 through 36. God remembers that he made a promise to David, and he said, actually, I'm not going to allow for there to no longer be any person from the line of David on the throne. He's still going to have a kingdom, and that would be Judah. That's Judah and Benjamin in the south. The other 10 tribes, Ephraim, Israel, they're in the north. So Solomon tries to kill this guy in chapter 11, verse 40. He fails. Rehoboam was then initially recognized by the 10 northern tribes, and then he immediately starts making the same mistakes. All those things that Samuel said kings were going to do, Rehoboam immediately starts doing. Instead of making their taxes lighter or requiring less people, he's going to increase them. He's going to say, y'all are going to have to do more. And so it just goes from bad to worse, and then immediately after that, Israel rebels whenever Jeroboam finally shows up to take over those 10 tribes, and now we got another civil war. Tracking with that? So that's it. That's the Judges all the way to Solomon's death. The final real monarch. Rehoboam and Jeroboam are going to fight it out tomorrow night. We'll see what happens with them. It doesn't go well. We're going to see the kingdom split between the north with Israel and the south with Judah. But this is where we've been. We talked about the Judges and how they were meant to work, how we got to having a monarchy, and then under Saul and how he screwed things up. And then we talked about how David eventually comes to the power, and then eventually Solomon, and now nobody. That's really the way we should think about it. So, what questions do you have concerning the Judges all the way to the end of Solomon's life? Bit of a sprint, I get it. Other questions? These lights are freaking out. We need to turn them off. All right, so this is where we're heading tomorrow. Let me give us a little bit of a preview. We're going to talk about the divided kingdom, the north with Israel and the south with Judah. We're going to talk about how the kingdom was actually divided, what happens with Jeroboam and Rehoboam. We're going to talk about the Assyrians, and then we're going to fast forward through all these random kings in the north and the south, and we're going to run straight towards these national and international powers with Assyria and how they destroy Israel in the north. Then we're going to talk about Ahaz and what happens with him in Damascus. That eventually spells the very end of the northern kingdom. We're going to talk about Josiah, who's like one of the really last good kings, period. And then we're going to talk about the Babylonians and how they're going to destroy the south. And then that's going to lead to eventually going to captivity in Babylon. And then we find ourselves with the Persians in charge, and that's where we'll end tomorrow night. This period that we're going to be talking about is probably about 300 years worth of stuff. So we're going to be flying, okay? Cool? All right, last call for questions. Did we have anything on the chat back there, Faith? All right, I didn't get anything on text. Let me pray for us. If y'all got any questions after this, I'll be hanging around. We'll turn these flickering lights off and we'll be good to go. Father, I thank you that we have seen clearly how you have been sovereignly governing and overseeing the rule of your people with Israel, all the way from the judges, and even when they were failures, that you were gracious enough to hear when they cried out and deliver them. And then whenever they cried out again, you were gracious enough, even in their own failure in demanding a king, you gave them a king. Maybe the one they wanted, but definitely the one they deserved. But God, we know that that eventually led to David and eventually to Solomon, and how this nation was flourishing under their rule whenever they were faithful to you. God, I pray that we would look to their example and see that this is a theological argument being made all the way through these books about how covenantal faithfulness to you is paramount. Not our comfort, not our abilities, not the things that we think are owed to us, but rather what we owe to you in obedience. God, I pray that you would drive us to a point where we understand how important that is, so that we might be more faithful to you, and so that we might be more loving and more worshipful because of what it is that we see happening around us. And God, I pray that we would recognize that all of these stories point to your Son, Christ, who ultimately, perfectly fulfilled the law and never disobeyed, and he is the example of perfect obedience in every aspect, even to the point of being obedient to dying on the cross for us. So God, I thank you for him ultimately, and how that is what frames our understanding of the Old Testament, and how this is really just precursors to what Christ would do and fulfill ultimately. So Father, I pray that you would increase our joy in this study. I pray that you would increase our knowledge. I pray that you would use this for your glory and for our good. And we pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. All right. We'll have the rest of this up on YouTube. If you got questions, drop them in there. We'll answer them after the fact. Y'all have a good night.